Good evening. This is Dr. Long at CTU for live chat January 10th, 2020. Happy New Year. So, what I want to talk about tonight is an application of design thinking in a setting where an organization is trying to update its strategy in preparation for a change of command where new bosses are coming in one and two levels, actually three levels higher. Our direct department is changing out in April. Our next higher deputy commandant has just changed out in the last couple months, and then we're going to receive a new three-star general commander. So all three of our direct reports are chain of command, if you will, have changed within the last, within a 6 month period. And they're all following a period of dramatic change in the Army and in our college. So we've just gone through some amazing transformations in our curriculum. And so, in the same way that organizations kind of diverge and then converge on their thinking and strategies, we may be in a position where the new guy that comes in may want to consolidate, or he may want to come in and add gas to our transformation. So we're not really sure what that's going to be. But in preparation for that, we're trying to do an internal summary of where we are and what we're doing and how we're trying to proceed in order to help shape this as a conversation with our bosses. This forces us to kind of reassess our position, strengths and weaknesses and so forth, so that we can be participants in this dialogue rather than just waiting to react to what the new boss says when he comes in. We want to give him some things to think about as well from the inside. So the application example then is to see how we might be thinking about, in a number of different organizations, how this kind of strategic update or strategic design can actually take place, and then compare that to the skill set that we've been learning in the course so far. So here's my contention, that when you're thinking about organizations and you're thinking about developing strategies, that there's a number of different operational variables that set the context of the environment that you're working in. So in my view, these are some things that you can consider as you're describing the environment that you're in. Is your organization public or private? So who are the owners and who are the people that we're working for? Is this an organization designed to make profit, or is it a nonprofit? Because that's going to shape your strategic choices and some of your constraints as well as your opportunities. What is the central organizing feature of this organization? Is it basically a social grouping? Is it a commercial enterprise? Is it a political orientation? Or is it a cultural organization? What's the central organizing theme? Because that's going to have an effect. Is it large versus medium versus small for that kind of an organization in the world, whether it's public or private or whatever? There are probably other organizations that have been formed in that same operational space. Compared to them, are you small, medium, or large? Geographically, we might think of, is it a local organization, regional, national, or global? So what is its span of control? What is its scope? Similarly, what's its time frame for operations? Was it conceived and is it operating as a short-term, medium, or long-term, or does it blend all three of those? The members that are in the organization, the components, the people, are they there on a voluntary basis? Do they come together as a team by choice? Was it something that was assigned to them as part of a career path? So there's less discretion in there, but it's not compulsory. Or is it something that's required either by law or by constraint or it's just something you have to do. So that can shape what you view as opportunities and choices. Um, is it a formal or an informal arrangement, this organization? Does it come together by chance or by design? Uh, so when we start thinking about these individual dimensions and we realize there's a number of choices, you could start combining these. Is it a public, nonprofit, social organization that is medium in scale, regional in scope, concerned about medium time frame, 3 to 5 years? It's a voluntary organization, and it is semi-formal or formal. So that's one type of an organization you can imagine. But when you start multiplying out all the possibilities and combinations, you realize just how varied the operational landscape is, with different kinds of organizations for different purposes, and they're not all symmetrical or synonymous or homogeneous. There's a real mix of competing values and timeframes and dimensions. Well, what do the words strategy and the organizational alignment processes mean under these different combinations? How could the interpretation be different, or measures of effectiveness and measures of performance? So when you think about how much that could vary based on your operational setting, we might then take a look at what we've learned so far in units 1, 2, and 3 and say, what do the tools that we've learned so far have to say about these different organizational possibilities? In my view, the things we've looked at are really focused on public organizations that are for profit, that are commercial, that are large in scale, that are at least national and probably global, that have long-term time horizons, that are working in as assigned people that are looking for a career path, and that they're formal. Well, that's just one of the operational settings that we can think about. So how well do these skill sets and concepts and models like Porter and so forth track to these other possibilities? And then I'll ask you to think about, for units 4 and 5, how and where are you going to seek to apply the concepts that are in this course? Are they sufficient for what it is that you're looking for? To what purpose and for what end are you going to be applying these concepts? Think about that as you're developing the strategy for IP number 5. You might want to explore that as an innovation or an opportunity to explore your own educational outcomes. Or you might look at that as picking a particular company to focus your strategy making on. It's sort of a rehearsal for what you might see as career opportunities later. As we've been thinking about those inside our military college, I would say we are a public organization. We are nonprofit. We are primarily, well, I guess I'd call it military or political in some sense. It's a large organization, big school. It has a global orientation. It combines short-term, medium, and long-term time dimensions out to 10 years, but also the next 2 years. It's an assigned course in an assigned environment, although the faculty is voluntary. Half the faculty is voluntary, half of them are assigned. And it's definitely formal, although it does have some elements of an informal overlay. So what we had been doing up until about this week was taking a look at our purpose and mission statements, and we were using inputs-based frame of reference to describe what we thought our missions were. For instance, we were saying things like, our purpose, our mission is to deliver world-class education, world-class professional military education. But we changed our mind this week. We said, no, what we're going to do is look at the outcomes, that the only purpose we're in that building for is to create competent field-grade officers for the Army and Department of Defense. And what do we mean by that? We mean that they are going to be capable of performing at skill level inside high level staffs as planners and managers and leaders, or run large scale units as commanders and planners and staff officers. So, in command of 1,000, or writing campaign plans for an entire theater of operations. So that leads you to the question of saying, if that's the decisive operation, then how do we know? And our moment of Zen this week was to say that turns out to be the question that we seek to answer every day. What are we doing today that is producing competent field grade officers? And how do we know that that's working? What was our assessment strategy? So looking at the end state rather than what we're doing on the inside, like trying to design really good lessons and then preparing faculty to teach those lessons and rehearsing the faculty as if those are the end states. Well, they're not. Those are really supporting and shaping operations. For example, it's reasonable to believe that you cannot create competent field grade officers without a good curriculum and without well trained faculty. But I actually can imagine a world in which we have less than perfect faculty and less than perfect lesson plans, and yet, nevertheless, through a combination of resources and doctrine and examples and hard work and student involvement in co creating their education and the good intentions of faculty and lots of iterations and continuous improvement, that we might not be perfect, and yet we could still produce competent field grade officers as our output. So that turns out to be the important thing to measure. That if you were only going to measure one thing, then what you should be measuring is the student competence and not measuring the quality of the lesson plans as if that was an end state. That's simply a bridge or one way in which you could contribute to a successful end state, but it's not the end state. So that shift in orientation has caused us to kind of reposition our attention to examine what is most important. And so now the question of how do you know is the ongoing urgent question that's the organizing principle about which we should feel very desperate every day. A sense of desperation and urgency to what can I do to get the best possible education into the hands of our students so that they can be better. And how do I know that that's actually working? And what can I try? And never settling for where we are, but always looking for ways to get even better, never resting. Well, that's a difference in orientation once you shift to an outputs-based orientation. So how do I translate this into a commercial activity? Well, if I'm in the business of providing goods and services to customers who have choices about where to go, then I should be concerned a little bit with how I'm doing that. But what I really should focus on primarily and ultimately and continuously is customer satisfaction with the products that we're shipping. And then working backwards from there to overcome those factors of dissatisfaction. And then figure out what I have to do with my production processes or support processes in order to make those improvements in the end state. But the orientation has to begin and end with the only thing that matters, and that's the ultimate decisive operation or the ultimate purpose. So if that's your culture, if that's your frame of reference, what that does is point you towards different kinds of plans and operations and models and processes that are designed to focus on what you have decided is important. That's a strategic choice that you make and a culture that you try to create as a frame of reference. So rather than externalize some things like maybe Porter does, this is sort of a relentless attention to detail on the customer satisfaction, helping the customer articulate what it is that they really want and need. Maybe the customer hasn't even figured that out yet. So if I really want to support them, then I should be part of the process that they use to define their core mission so that I can understand at a deep level how I can support them with what I do. I'm not in their organization, but I'm actually connected to them, so I have a vested interest in helping them figure out exactly what they want so that I can provide the unique goods and services that they need to be successful. So by helping them become successful, I'm actually helping myself become successful. So I really do want to be on their team. I'm not going to just wait and be told what it is that they want, but I'm going to engage with them in helping to define those requirements. I cannot think of a example of an organization providing support to somebody where that frame of reference is not a reasonable way to proceed. So I'd be interested in what you think about that. Can you imagine a place where that doesn't apply? And why do you think that would be the case? Or can you think of a place in which this is a new way of thinking that might give you new insights into how to develop new strategies? Feel free to write about that in any of the DBs or on the IPs, including IP number 5. I think that's the ongoing urgent question. What is it from your perspective that you need from this course and from this program to help you achieve what you define as success in your endeavors after the program's over? I need to understand that so I can help shape the remainder of this course to support what it is that you want to do. That's strategy and organizational alignment in practical application. Now, I would also say that the structure of the lessons that we have do a very good job of addressing one segment of the market, which is how to provide strategy and organizational alignment to a very large set of organizations that are, public corporations that are struggling to make their way in the world, trying to make a profit and do good. And then a lot of those tools and techniques can be applied in many different ways. But start with that analysis by output with you and your needs as a centerpiece of that. And how would you know if you are achieving competency in the things that you're trying to learn? What do you have to be able to do in order to be competent as a strategist and as a organizational aligner? Because the answer to that question is how you respond to the CEO who's wondering if they should hire you. What is it that you can do, and how can you help me achieve my goals? So if you think about what it is that you add to the equation as a value producer, as a value creator, now you're in a position to help them see how to use the resources that you bring to the table, why they might want to hire you. So give that line of thinking some effort if it appeals to you, and we can develop some ideas along those lines. Well, if that's what our organization is talking about, how are we specifically going about it? Well, I've been introducing some ideas from lean thinking and the Toyota production system and the Japanese technique of Kanban. So I thought I would share with you some of those ideas because I believe this is an orientation towards producing goods and services that has a very broad applicability in the how to do things inside organizations. And the ways in which you get things done actually provide some insights into the kinds of strategies and the output of a strategic process that you're trying to create. So I want to share with you what I think is maybe the best book that I've found and read on that subject so far, and one that I'm studying with great care. So I want to summarize the essential ideas of this book called Real World Kanban, Real World Kanban, in 2015 by Matthias Skarin. And the topics are a combination or the intersection of Kanban, which is a request, and lean thinking. So lean thinking seeks to eliminate waste. As an example of this, at Toyota, one of the things that they look to eliminate waste, they define waste as this. Let me show you. In lean thinking, so we can zoom in on this a little bit. A lean orientation is all about creating value for the customer, and anything that you do that is burning resources, any expenditure of resources on something that does not create value for the customer is waste. And with that orientation, you end up moving along this continuum that your first effort is to reduce waste. And so at Toyota, what that means is they actually measure how much empty space is in the packages that they send to their customers. They are measuring the volume of air and saying how much money did we spend on shipping air to our customers. So they're trying to make the package as small and as efficient as possible so that it weighs less and takes up the least amount of room so that they can spend the absolute minimum on shipping. They do not want to ship air to their customers, in the form of too large of a box. So if you're shipping air, that means that the box is larger than it needed to be, which means that you spent more on cardboard and packing material than you had to, and all it was doing was shipping air at some additional cost. That's how relentless they are in identifying and then eliminating waste. Well, reducing waste in itself, although it's helpful, doesn't get you to really effective output. So after you've adopted the reduce waste mentality, the next level up of management is one in which you are improving the management of flow between workstations, where you're converting raw materials and labor and capital and time and information into the value added product that you're going to sell. And so by improving the flow, you can reduce waste and become more effective and reduce costs. So you move from simple efficiency and resource allocation to improving the management of your flow. After you've kind of mastered that, the next level up is really conducting a value chain analysis to decide where are the value adds in my process and eliminate the things that are not creating value, and improving the value creation efficiency. And then adopting an end-to-end approach where I take a look at optimizing the whole rather than increments or subsets or sub-optimizing smaller pieces. So when you have traveled this virtuous path, it starts with reducing waste, improves flow, then improves the creation of value, and then takes an end-to-end. There's a very systems thinking process orientation that informs the entire effort. And that's one of the essences of lean thinking and Kanban as an orientation. So let's take a little bit deeper look at this, okay? So this book on real-world Kanban by Skarin really is an introduction to both Kanban thinking and lean thinking. But 80% of the book is addressing 4 different case studies in which Kanban and lean thinking as an approach to continuous improvement was very successful. And the nature of the 4 case studies shows just how robust this idea and this approach, this management and planning frame of reference really can be. I would add a 5th case study to this one, which is how we're applying these principles in the way that we are improving the quality of our lessons, the quality of our and skill sets of our faculty, and shifting our orientation to the value that we create in our end product, which is those competent field grade officers. So in these 4 case studies, the first one takes a look at one organization that used Kanban and lean thinking at the enterprise level to improve the time to market of their good ideas. So in other words, it was accelerating the innovation chain to create value at the end of the day in their customers. So reducing the time that it took to improve value. In the second one, they were using Kanban and lean thinking to improve the effectiveness of their teamwork inside a change management project. So they were trying to use good management principles like Kanban and lean thinking to improve the way they were transforming the internal operations of their organization. So they were looking at their own process as the end state in this case. In the third case study, they were using Kanban and lean thinking to improve the project management system that they were using to meet a deadline for customer service. So an externally oriented approach, trying to create value for the way they delivered improvements to their customer, but then using Kanban and lean thinking to improve how they were managing that project. So not so much as change management as far as it was efficient and effective management with a customer orientation. And then finally, in the fourth case study, they were looking at a growth company in a growth phase of their life cycle, and they were trying to keep up with the rate of change that was being introduced in their daily operations. So it was like a continuous learning, continuous modernization, and their existing um, model of change looks something like the Kurt Lewin model of you unfreeze the status quo in order to make some changes, and then you lock it in. So freeze, unfreeze, freeze approach. Well, that gets you to a very incremental, um, phased approach to change, which is appropriate if there's not a lot of change, or if you're just trying to upgrade to a new environment and then try to remain stable. But if you're living in a world in which the rate of change is something like a constant or accelerating, you can't afford to keep freezing. You have to remain constantly agile and adaptive, and that requires a different mindset. And so they were looking to change their approach to modernization and updating to one that was more dynamic and was reflected in the style of thinking that we would call Kanban and lean thinking. So in those four case studies, plus what I'm describing as the fifth case study of updating the professional development of our teaching faculty and the way we design curricular lessons and how we provide choices and a student orientation or a student focus in the way we're assessing our outputs, that's a fifth way in which Kanban and lean thinking can really be applied. So there's a very broad and diverse set of operational environments or ecosystems in which this management and strategy approach could really apply. Well, you may ask, then, can you tell me more about Kanban and lean thinking? Yes, yes, I can. I would introduce it by saying that whenever you're engaging in the introduction of Kanban and lean thinking as a way to proceed, it's often quite a cultural shift, and so it's not enough just to know it with your rational mind in your head. You also have to feel it in your heart of why it's relevant and important that you succeed, and you have to feel it in your gut so you know where the risks are, but yet have the emotional courage to keep on going. And then you have to have the skills in your hands to be able to know how to do it in each little task and transaction. And then you have to have the knowledge in your feet that helps you walk the path of many iterations and lots of transactions. So you need the 5 ways of knowing in order to really help you achieve success when you're implementing any kind of cultural or procedural process change, not just Kanban and lean thinking, but really anything. So the knowledge of the head, the heart, the gut, the hands, and the feet. Well, in this book, Kanban, lean thinking, the real world of Kanban, practical application of Kanban, he introduces the ideas by saying, look, you have to have the courage to change. So to me, that is the heart and the gut. The heart tells me why I have to change, and my gut tells me I got to overcome risks. So that's why I need courage to be able to face that uncertainty. So you have to get past just the knowledge of the head. You have to address the heart and the gut. And then he says, look, you're going to be looking for ways to seize opportunities as they arrive and as you detect them. Don't think that you can do this with some kind of one-time grand master plan, but no, opportunities to make substantive improvements are going to happen as we go. And then you're going to need time and patience because it will take time and multiple iterations and learning as you go and overcoming less than perfect outcomes. But that's sort of the expectation. And that's why you need courage to keep going when things don't go exactly perfectly each time. It takes time and patience to do that. Well, if those are the emotional preconditions, that's what you might think of as the role of leadership, is to ensure that we maintain that focus and look to underwrite the honest efforts of people that while they're learning to do these new things. So I would say maybe that's the role of leadership. Well, in terms of knowledge of the head, then, we can talk about the Kanban rules that say these 5 things are what we mean by applying Kanban thinking and process. First, that when you have a chain of process steps, that the later processes tell the earlier processes when they need new items. So what do I mean by that? So imagine you had some kind of, let's just call it steps in a process. And it looks something like this. I had this station, and then this station, and then this station, and then this station. So I had 4 steps on things that I'm finally going to deliver to a customer. So I have my supplies back here, piles of resources, and then I get them to the first station, and then I make some, and then it goes to the second station, third station, fourth station. Now, if you are thinking about just pure cost and efficiency, one of the things that typically happens is you try to produce as much of this as you can, and then you end up having some inventory. And then you ship it down here. Now this guy has a backlog of inventory because he can only produce things at a certain rate. And so what happens is you start shipping things down, you start accumulating all this excess inventory that's just work. It's not work in process, it's work in just waiting. Now you have to be able to, there's a cost of storing it and managing it. And then what happens if the customer's requirement changes or we discover some design change? I now have to take what do I do with all this scrap material? Or what do I have to have another process that translates this into the new version, 1.2 or something? So now I have rework costs because I spent the money to make an obsolete thing. I didn't know it was obsolete at the time, but because it wasn't ready to ship, I incurred a bunch of costs for premature production and then storage and inventory management and then modernization and then I have to re-inspect it. Like if it was 3 months from the time I made it and put it in the piles, it's still the specification. So now I have to revalidate that it has met the requirement, and maybe some defects were introduced because of that time lag or because of environmental changes. So in order to get away from that kind of push production, rule number 1 in Kanban is that later processes tell earlier processes when the new items are needed. So we wait for station 4 to say, I'm now ready to receive product from station 3. Then and only then do we fire up this system to produce those things that can then be fed right into that process. Now, all I need is just enough of a buffer so that when it gets to a certain level, it says, I now have 5 things left. So I send a Kanban card up to this process and say, make me some new product. And then in the time that it takes to make that product and then ship it, I will have depleted the buffer, and now the new thing arrives just in time to feed right in, and now I've eliminated most of this storage here, and I have just a supply buffer so I can keep this thing continuously producing according to customers. So now what I want to do is actually treat the customer as a demand signal, and I don't want to prematurely produce things. I want to reduce that to the minimum scale so that when the customer gives me their new requirement, if necessary, I can go all the way back to the start and redesign all the things so that I can produce exactly what it is that they want. And maybe I have to do some retooling. So this whole notion of later processes tell earlier processes when new items are needed, that really now means that we're examining things from a demand or a pull point of view. Then rule number 2 is that the earlier process then produces what the later process needs, and that means by understanding the requirement and then making sure that what I'm producing actually meets that requirement. And then the third rule is that no item can be made or moved without a Kanban, without an explicit demand. I don't just produce it just in case, but I wait for an actual demand signal. And then fourth, defects are not sent to the next phase, and that means I have an external process that checks the quality to specification before I ship it, and then I have a receipt inspection checklist that says before acceptance, I do a final handoff to make sure that it still meets the requirements so that I don't give them bad stuff, which then gets put into their process and then doesn't work, so I don't ship bad parts. And then the fifth rule, I reduce the demands to lower my inventory, so I time it just enough demands. And then by doing that, I will have made a very lean process that doesn't incur extra costs and overproduction and obsolete production, and being in a hurry, which introduces faults and lack of quality. So the fifth rule, then, by reducing the demands to just the minimum, allows me to lower my inventory costs and to reveal problems that may be in the way that I've set up the process. I can now find ways to reduce non-value added time. So now I'm using lean thinking to think about what is adding value, what is not, so I can eliminate that waste, improve the flow, improve the value to the customer, and then focus on end-to-end production of value with a customer orientation. Well, if those are the rules, how do I achieve that? What are my 6 core practices, you ask? Well, the first thing I have to do is visualize the workflow. Think about what I just did. I drew this as a process map and then understood the components, but then also the interfaces, and looked at it as a dynamic flow, which I'm now looking to improve the flow, not just by eliminating waste, but improving the way I've set up the physical space to reduce unnecessary movements and so forth. I'm then going to limit work in process through the use of that explicit Kanban process to pull things forward. I'm then going to manage the flow so that I am reducing the cost of movements and manufacturing. I'm going to make my process policies explicit, so it's going to be rule-based so that everybody can see what the requirements are and we're not managing by anecdote. I'm going to implement feedback loops between all phases and stages so that I can apply the principles of continuous quality improvement to not ship bad parts and always increase the value that I'm creating. So now I'm using that feedback to improve value, and I'm looking at it from end to end. And then finally, I'm going to improve collaboratively by working together with my suppliers and my customers and my internal process teams. And then I'm going to evolve experimentally by trying things in small batches or small processes to see if I can actually achieve value add through the use of experimentation and pilot programs, and then look to do things that will scale. Well, if I do all those things, what I now have to do is, instead of just trying to find the minimum and then just standardize and leave it alone, I really have to nurture thinking people rather than just producing good enough templates. I actually have to nurture thinking people who will be continuously looking at how to find value improvements and eliminating waste and improving the flows and better meet the customer's requirements by helping the customer understand what they require even better so that I can produce what they want. I need to continually develop my people to think in these ways. And that's maybe what this introductory lesson to Kanban and lean thinking is all about, is trying to find ways to develop thinkers at all my stations and not just robots. I want self-aware, self-adaptive learning, continuously improving humans, and I'm going to invest in the development of my people as a strategy in order to be able to implement lean thinking. So that means I'm actually cultivating people that are courageous and who can learn to see and then seize and exploit opportunities while managing risk, and who have the emotional intelligence as leaders and followers and team members to give things the time and patience that it needs to realize the improvements that we hope to achieve, and that we are realistic in about what we can achieve, and that we respect courageous activity and we reward courage, and that we're not afraid to fail if it was a learning opportunity. That's the only failure, is the failure to learn. So I'm not going to judge people by the mistakes that they make exclusively, but in how they respond and react to those mistakes as a learning opportunity. So that's the essence of the introductory elements of this book, Real World Practical Kanban by Matthias Skeren from 2015. We've looked at some of the rules and the principles and the wide variety of application, what it means. I would just kind of summarize it by saying these Kanban rules, really, we've got to learn to look at the demands for products and services from the customer. We've got to learn how to get deep, clear, precise understandings of the specifications so we know exactly what it is that's needed. We have to identify what the requirement is and why it's a need and why it's important, and then learn what quality means, what better performance actually means, and then learn how to measure it, and then build it into our systems, and then learn how to use this lean thinking to use end-to-end orientation to improve our value and our flow, and by reducing waste, and learn how to just be relentless about don't do useless activities. Do not engage in useless activities, which would be something that generates waste. So, that's tonight's thought experiment on Kanban as a strategic and an operational approach.